I never thought my life would turn into something out of a soap opera, but here we are. It all started when I was 14. My dad, my rock, my biggest supporter, got sick. At first, it was just exhaustion, a little weight loss. We figured it was stress, work catching up to him, until one day Mom sat me down at our worn-out kitchen table and told me what the doctors had said. Stage 4. No cure. The next 6 months unraveled like some cruel time lapse. Dad, once this strong, steady force, withered away before my eyes. The man who used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could touch the sky was suddenly too weak to climb the stairs. Even then, he still tried to make me laugh, still helped me with homework when he could barely hold a pen. The last thing he ever said to me, before they took him to the hospital for the last time, was, "Kiddo, don't let your mom's lasagna kill you before I get back." He didn't get back. He died on a Thursday. I remember because Thursdays were our pizza nights. Instead of sitting on the couch, eating deep dish and watching reruns, I sat in a sterile hospital waiting room, watching my mother sob into her hands. I thought that was the worst thing that could happen to me, but life had more surprises in store. Mom didn't just grieve, she spiraled. 2 months after Dad's funeral, she started dating again. Said she needed to feel alive, whatever that meant. Enter Gerard, real estate developer, loaded, twice divorced. He had a sports car, a yacht, and a smirk that never quite reached his eyes. Within a year, they were married. I didn't even know about the engagement. One day, Mom just handed me a bridesmaid dress and told me to try it on. A month later, I stood in a country club ballroom, surrounded by strangers in designer suits, wondering how my life had derailed so fast. And then came the final blow. Mom and Gerard moved into his mansion, a sprawling estate with a private theater and a freaking bowling alley. But, apparently, there wasn't room for me. "I just think it'd be better for you to stay with family," she said, not meeting my eyes. "Your aunt has plenty of space." So, at 15, I was packed up like an afterthought and sent to live with Aunt Valerie and her perfect, privileged family in Chicago. Aunt Valerie, Uncle Greg, and their 2 kids, Simon and Olivia, lived in an upscale townhouse in Lincoln Park. It had a marble staircase, a chandelier in the foyer, and an energy that screamed you don't belong here. I used to be close to Simon and Olivia when we were kids, back when summers meant chasing fireflies and building pillow forts, but that was before. Now, I was an unwanted house guest. Simon, who was a year younger than me, had a habit of accidentally knocking my things off the bathroom counter. Olivia, a year older, made passive-aggressive comments about how some people couldn't afford nice clothes. Aunt Valerie wasn't any better. She made it clear from day one that I was a burden. She even started charging me rent. At 15, I tried calling Mom, hoping, stupidly, that she'd intervene, but her responses became less and less frequent. Eventually, she stopped answering altogether. Meanwhile, her social media was full of vacation pictures, champagne toasts in Paris, sunset cruises in Santorini. Her new life, where I was a footnote at best. I had 2 choices, sink or swim. I chose to swim. I got a job at a laundromat. It was in a sketchy part of town, wedged between a closed-down pet store and a pawn shop that definitely dealt in stolen goods. The owner, Benny, was an old guy with a perpetual scowl and a soft spot for desperate teenagers. "Midnight shifts are tough," he warned. "I can handle it," I said. He let me start that night. From then on, my life was a relentless cycle of exhaustion. Midnight to 6 a.m. at the laundromat, then school from 8 to 3, then a second job at a gas station from 4 to 10 p.m. Homework? Sleep? Who had time for that? My cousins made sure everyone at school knew about my jobs. Simon and his friends would come into the gas station and make a mess just to watch me clean it up. Olivia would post pictures of me in my ugly uniform with captions like, "Ugh, imagine." People at school started leaving quarters on my desk. Someone stuck a note on my locker that said "Laundry Girl." Real original. The only person who didn't treat me like trash was a homeless guy named Pete who hung around the laundromat. He taught me how to fix the jammed coin machines, and which customers were okay to let slide when they were short a quarter. One night, he looked at me and said, "Kid, you're playing life on hard mode." I laughed. First time in weeks. But my breaking point came when I got home from a shift and found my room torn apart. My mattress flipped, drawers open. My emergency cash stash, everything I'd saved up, gone. Olivia swore she had no idea. Aunt Valerie's response? You should be more careful with your money. That same week, she raised my rent. Again. I did the math. Even with 2 jobs, I couldn't afford it anymore. But I had a plan. I'd been taking community college classes, trying to get ahead. If I dropped my rent payments, I could afford to take more classes, maybe even transfer out someday. So I packed up my Toyota, a rusted-out relic whose heater only worked if you smacked the dashboard just right, and drove away. First night sleeping in that car wasn't so bad. Parked behind the laundromat, curled up in the back seat under layers of stolen, lost, and found blankets. I can handle this, I told myself. Then winter hit. Real Chicago winter. The kind that makes your bones ache. The kind where your breath turns to frost inside your car. I could barely run the engine. I was burning through gas too fast. Some nights, I wrapped myself in every piece of clothing I owned and prayed my body heat would be enough. And then, the worst part, Simon found out. He must have followed me one night, because the next morning, there was a TikTok. A full-on documentary about my life in the back seat of my car. They filmed everything. Me studying under the laundromat's neon glow. Me curled up in the driver's seat. Even me changing shirts in the back. The captions were brutal. Can you believe my cousin lives like this? It went viral, at least in their rich kid circles. After that, people started driving by the laundromat at night, honking, throwing things. Cops started knocking on my window every other night. You can't sleep here, miss. So I drive in circles, watching my gas gauge drop lower and lower, praying I'd have enough to make it to work the next day. And then I noticed it. A black SUV, parked across the street. Always in a different spot, always watching. At first, I thought it was cops, or worse, but they never approached me. Until one night. The temperature had dropped below 0. My car wouldn't start. My phone was dead. The laundromat was closed for maintenance. I pulled my coat tighter and thought, well, this is it. This is how I die. And then, a knock on my window. I looked up. There, standing in the snow, was Uncle Greg. And he said, we need to talk. The moment I saw Uncle Greg standing outside my car, I thought I was hallucinating from the cold. He was the last person I expected to show up in the middle of the night, standing there like it was perfectly normal to find his niece half frozen in a beat-up Toyota. For a second, neither of us moved. Then he knocked again, sharper this time. Open up, he said. I hesitated. Part of me thought this was some setup, another cruel trick orchestrated by Aunt Valerie or my cousins. But another part of me, the part that was so tired of surviving alone, was desperate to hear what he had to say. I unlocked the door. The second he got a good look at me, his face shifted. I must have looked awful. My lips were numb, my fingers stiff, my breath coming out in little white clouds. Without a word, he shrugged off his thick wool coat and draped it over my shoulders. Get in my car, he said. I hesitated. Why? My office has better heating. That was it. No lecture. No judgment. Just a statement, like it was obvious. I wanted to argue, tell him I was fine, that I didn't need his help. But I couldn't feel my toes, my car wasn't starting, and I was one bad night away from becoming a statistic. So, for once, I swallowed my pride and followed him. He led me to the black SUV that had been tailing me for weeks. When I got in, the warmth hit me so hard I almost started crying. Uncle Greg didn't say anything as he drove. No small talk, no questions. Just silence, save for the hum of the heater and the low sound of some old jazz playing from the radio. We pulled up to the laundromat, but instead of leading me inside, he took me through a side door, up a narrow set of stairs I'd never noticed before. At the top was a door. He unlocked it. Welcome to my office, he said. The room was small but neat, desk, mini fridge, couch, and a tiny bathroom. There was even a coffee machine on the counter. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm. I stood there, trying to process everything, while Uncle Greg poured 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me, then leaned against his desk, watching me. I took a sip, and for the first time in months, I felt something other than exhaustion. Then he finally spoke. You know, he said, your dad and I used to sleep in a car, too. I froze. What? He pulled out his phone and showed me a photo. It was old, slightly faded, but clear enough. Two skinny teenagers sitting in the back of a rusty van, eating beans straight from the can. That's your dad on the left, he said. And there he was, my father, young, grinning, hair a mess. I'd never seen this side of him before. You always thought of me as the rich uncle, right? Greg continued. But we weren't always like this. We grew up broke. Our mom worked 3 jobs just to keep a roof over our heads. Some nights, we didn't even have that. I stared at the picture, trying to reconcile the uncle I knew, the real estate mogul in $1,000 suits, with the kid in that photo. How did you? He smirked, like he knew exactly what I was thinking. Hard work, a little luck, and this laundromat. He gestured around the room. The old owner let us crash here on the worst nights, he explained. We'd help out, fixing machines, cleaning up. One day, he got sick and offered to sell the place. Your dad was in college by then, but I'd been working construction, saving every penny. Bought it for next to nothing. That was my first property. I swallowed hard, feeling something strange settle in my chest. Your dad, Uncle Greg hesitated. He made me promise 2 things before he died. First, to look out for you. Second, to make sure you learn to look out for yourself. Something in his tone made my stomach twist. So what? I asked. You let me struggle just to see if I could handle it? His expression darkened. No, I wanted to step in sooner, but your aunt. He cut himself off, exhaling sharply. Let's just say I needed to make sure you were the one who deserved help, not them. I frowned. What does that mean? Instead of answering, he pulled a key from his pocket and set it on the desk. For the apartment upstairs, he said. I blinked. The what? There's a studio above this office. Nothing fancy, but it's yours. No rent, as long as you keep working here and keep your grades up. My first instinct was to refuse. This felt too much like charity, like a handout. But Uncle Greg must have seen the protest forming on my lips, because he shook his head. This isn't charity, he said. It's an investment. You've got your dad's brains and your own kind of stubbornness. I'm investing in that. I stared at the key, my hands shaking. For months, I'd been fighting to survive. Now, for the first time in a long time, someone was fighting for me. I picked up the key. That night, I slept in a real bed. A tiny, worn-down mattress in a drafty studio apartment above a laundromat. But it was mine. For the first time in months, I wasn't just surviving. I was starting over. Waking up in the apartment above the laundromat felt surreal. The mattress was old, the radiator rattled like it was coughing up its last breath, and the whole place smelled faintly of detergent and dust. But it was warm. It was mine. For the first time in forever, I didn't have to wake up in a car with frost on the windows. I didn't have to spend half my morning in a gas station bathroom, trying to make myself look presentable. It wasn't perfect, but it was a miracle. And as it turned out, miracles made people very angry. I found out the hard way the next morning when I got to work. Simon had driven past the laundromat on his way to school and spotted me coming down from the upstairs apartment. Because of course he did. And because he was Simon, he took pictures. By the time my shift started, the entire family group chat was on fire. Aunt Valerie was furious. At 11 a.m. sharp, she stormed into the laundromat like an avenging angel in Lululemon leggings, sunglasses perched on her head like a crown. She spotted me behind the counter, and her mouth curled in this tight, plastic smile. We need to talk. I sighed, already exhausted. I'm working. Oh, don't worry, she said, voice dripping with venom. I won't take up much of your valuable time. The few customers in the laundromat turned to watch. Aunt Valerie wasn't exactly the type to make a quiet scene. You think you can just weasel your way into my husband's money? She hissed, stepping closer. I blinked. What? Oh, don't play innocent, sweetheart. She waved a manicured hand. Living in his building, working at his business, playing the poor little orphan. I should have seen it sooner. I gritted my teeth. I'm not playing anything. I was homeless. Because of you. Her face twisted. I was teaching you responsibility. I laughed, harsh and humorless. Oh, right. Charging a teenager rent while her own mother was off playing trophy wife? That's not responsibility. That's greed. Her eyes flashed, but before she could snap back, a new voice cut through the laundromat. She's not the one who's greedy. We both turned. Uncle Greg stood in the doorway, arms crossed, looking completely unfazed. His voice was quiet, but it carried, calm, heavy, dangerous. Aunt Valerie flinched. Just barely. Greg, she said, trying to recover. This is a family matter. He raised an eyebrow. Oh, because I am family. And I'd love to hear why you think kicking my niece onto the street was a good idea. Aunt Valerie stiffened. She was ungrateful. She worked 2 jobs to survive. His voice was like steel. She put herself through school while you and your kids mocked her. You raised her rent every time she got close to standing on her own 2 feet. And now, you're mad because I stepped in. Valerie's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, she looked unsettled. Stay out of this, Greg, she warned. This isn't your problem. He smiled. Not nicely. Oh, but it is. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I've been looking through our finances, Val, he said, voice almost too casual. And I noticed some interesting transactions. Her face paled. I frowned. What kind of transactions? Greg didn't take his eyes off his wife. The kind that involve large sums of money disappearing into offshore accounts. The laundromat went silent. For a moment, I thought I imagined it. But then, she froze. Just for a second. Aunt Valerie's hands clenched. You don't know what you're talking about. Uncle Greg tilted his head. Don't I? He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tapped the screen. Then he turned it toward her. I couldn't see what was on it, but whatever it was, she flinched. Visibly. It hit me then. She wasn't just cruel. She was hiding something. I swallowed. A new kind of cold settling into my bones. Uncle Greg watched her reaction, then slipped his phone back into his pocket. You've been stealing from me, he said quietly. No. I trusted you, he continued, voice almost too soft. You handled all the paperwork, the accounts. I let you control everything. Aunt Valerie tried to compose herself, smoothing her hair, but I could see the cracks forming. You're being paranoid, she said. You're going to believe her over me? Your wife. Greg's expression didn't change. I believe the numbers. Aunt Valerie opened her mouth again, probably to spin another lie, but Uncle Greg cut her off. You should go, he said simply. It wasn't a request. For the first time in my life, I saw real fear in her eyes. But she covered it up fast. You'll regret this, she snapped. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The second she was gone, the tension in the room collapsed. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I turned to Uncle Greg. What the hell was that? He exhaled, rubbing his temples. That, he said, was the beginning of the end. I swallowed. End of what? His eyes met mine. My marriage. I didn't know what to say to that. I just knew, whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be small. And for once, I wasn't the one falling apart. The days after Aunt Valerie's meltdown at the laundromat were eerily quiet. Too quiet. I half expected her to show up again, screaming about betrayal, but she didn't. Instead, Simon and Olivia stopped talking to me at school altogether. No more smug whispers in the hallways. No more staged TikToks about my tragic life. It was like I didn't exist. And for a while, I thought maybe that was the end of it. I should have known better. Because a week later, my mother showed up at my apartment. I was coming back from my shift, still half asleep, when I found her waiting by my door. She looked expensive. Like always. A perfectly tailored coat, flawless makeup, the kind of perfume that smelled like generational wealth. But there was something off. Her smile was too tight, her hands fidgety. Mom, I said, confused. Oh, honey, she cooed, stepping forward like we were about to have some heartfelt reunion. I've missed you so much. I didn't move. She hadn't spoken to me in months. Not when I was struggling, not when I was sleeping in my car. But now she cared? I crossed my arms. What are you doing here? Her smile flickered, but she recovered fast. I heard some concerning things about you and Greg. I stiffened. Here we go. What kind of things? I asked flatly. Her voice softened, like she was talking to a toddler. Sweetie, I know you're in a difficult place, and I understand why you'd want to attach yourself to someone with resources, but I blinked. Are you seriously implying? She sighed dramatically, placing a hand on her chest. I just don't want you to make a mistake. Greg is a married man and— Oh my God, stop, I snapped. She blinked, stunned. I'd never raised my voice at her before. This isn't about me, I said, voice shaking with fury. You don't care about my well-being. You never did. If you did, you'd have picked up the phone when I was homeless instead of pretending I didn't exist. Her expression hardened. That's not fair. No, what's not fair is you standing here pretending to be my mother now, when the only reason you're here is because you're scared. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You heard Greg is looking into Valerie, I continued, watching her carefully. And now you're worried about what that means for you. Her face flickered. Gotcha. I let out a hollow laugh. Let me guess. Valerie called you, crying about how Greg is turning against her? Told you he's cutting her off? She hesitated just a second too long. I scoffed. Unbelievable. Honey, she tried again, but I stepped past her and unlocked my door. She reached for my arm. At least let me. I yanked away. You know what's funny? I asked, turning to face her. You're so worried about me manipulating Greg, but the real gold digger in this family isn't me. It's you. Her eyes flared with rage. How dare you? No, how dare you? My voice cracked. You married Gerard months after Dad died, dumped me on Valerie, and never looked back. And now, you suddenly care? Please. She opened her mouth, then closed it. I shook my head. Go home, Mom. Her hands clenched at her sides. You'll regret speaking to me like this. I gave her a sad smile. Maybe, but at least I'll know who I am. I shut the door in her face. I expected her to knock, to yell. She didn't. I listened to her heels click against the floor as she walked away. And for the first time in years, I felt nothing. A few nights later, Greg called me into his office. Close the door, he said. I did. He was sitting at his desk, papers spread out in front of him. His face was unreadable. I need to ask you something, he said. I tensed. Okay. Has Valerie ever asked you for money? I frowned. No. He nodded slowly. And Olivia? Simon? No, but— I hesitated. They stole from me once. His head snapped up. What? I sighed. It was months ago. I had a stash of cash saved up, and one day, I came home and it was gone. Olivia swore she didn't know anything about it. Greg exhaled sharply. I shifted uncomfortably. Why does this matter? He steepled his fingers. Because Valerie has been siphoning money out of my accounts for over a year. I froze. What? I have proof now. She's been moving money into secret accounts. Money that was supposed to go toward business expenses, property taxes, even— he hesitated. Even Olivia and Simon's college funds. I sucked in a breath. She stole from her own kids? Greg's jaw tightened. And that's not the worst part. I felt sick. What is the worst part? He hesitated. Then he turned his laptop screen toward me. It was an email thread. From Valerie. The latest message was short. Everything is ready. I'll see you soon. V. The email she was responding to was from someone saved as D. Derek. My mother's husband. I stared at the screen, the words swimming before my eyes. She's running away, Greg said. With your mother's husband. I swallowed hard. And for the first time, I felt something for my mother. Not anger. Not hatred. Just pity. Because she had no idea what was coming. The revelation sat between us like a live grenade. Valerie and Derek. Together. Plotting to steal everything and run. It was almost too insane to believe. Almost. But I'd spent enough time being a casualty of my family's greed to know better. How long? I asked, my voice oddly steady. Greg exhaled through his nose. Months. Maybe longer. The money trail goes back over a year. A year. That meant she was stealing from you while I was sleeping in my car. I let out a hollow laugh. And here I thought she just hated me. Turns out she was too busy embezzling to care. Greg didn't respond. His face was unreadable, but I could see it in his eyes. This quiet, controlled fury. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to process it. But then, another thought hit me. What about Mom? Greg's expression darkened. I don't know. I swallowed hard. If she knew, she'd have stopped by to gloat. If she didn't know. I trailed off, my stomach twisting. Greg tapped a pen against his desk. There's only one way to find out. 2 days later, the plan was set. Greg had his lawyers working overtime, tracking every stolen cent, gathering evidence. The goal? Catch Valerie and Derek before they could disappear. We had to move fast, and Greg had a very specific idea for how to do it. We need a public setting, he said. Somewhere they'll feel safe. Somewhere we can corner them. I frowned. Like what? A dinner? He smirked. Better. The night of Simon's 18th birthday party, the house was packed. Valerie had planned the whole thing, blissfully unaware that she was walking into her own execution. The backyard was covered in twinkling lights. A DJ was blasting top 40 hits, and rich kids in designer clothes were mingling by the pool, sipping from gold-rimmed glasses. It was the kind of party that screamed money. The kind of party Valerie would throw before vanishing with millions. But she had no idea the noose was tightening. Greg had invited a few extra guests. His lawyer, his accountant, and, though none of them knew it yet, 2 federal agents waiting nearby. The plan was simple. Once everyone was gathered inside, Greg would present the evidence. He'd show the bank transfers, the emails, the stolen funds. He'd confront her in front of everyone. Her kids, her friends, the people she spent years pretending to be better than. And then, the agents would step in. It was perfect. It was airtight. But nothing ever goes as planned. Because before Greg could make his move, Valerie vanished. 1 minute, she was laughing with guests. The next, she was gone. Greg's phone buzzed. An unknown number. A single message. Nice try. My stomach dropped. They know. Greg swore under his breath. We need to move. Now. We split up. Greg and the lawyers went inside, hoping to catch Derek before he disappeared, while I searched the backyard. I scanned the crowd, my heart pounding. The music, the lights, the laughter. It was all background noise. I was only focused on one thing, finding her. And then, movement near the hedge line. A flash of expensive fabric. I took off. I slipped through the crowd, moving fast, ignoring the strange looks I got as I sprinted across the manicured lawn. I reached the hedge, shoving past the branches, and there she was, Valerie. Her heels dug into the dirt, her coat clutched in one hand, her purse in the other. She was running, but she wasn't alone. Standing next to her, holding a suitcase, was my mother. The world tilted. Mom. She knew. I stepped forward, branches snapping under my feet. Valerie whipped around, eyes wild. But Mom just sighed. I was hoping you wouldn't see this, she said. My throat went dry. You're leaving. With him. She lifted a shoulder. It's not like I have a choice. I let out a sharp laugh, too harsh to be real. Right. Because Derek forced you into stealing millions? Her jaw tensed. You don't understand. No, I shot back. I do. I turned to Valerie. You weren't just running away with Derek. I looked back at Mom. You were running with her. She didn't deny it. I took a step closer, my blood boiling. What was the plan, huh? Disappear into the sunset while I spent the rest of my life scrubbing floors? Live off stolen money while I slept in a goddamn car? Valerie snapped. You don't get to judge me, you little. But Mom held up a hand. Enough. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. I wasn't going to let you struggle forever, she said softly. I would have sent for you. Eventually. I stared at her. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel hurt. I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. You're pathetic, I said. Her eyes flickered. But before she could speak, a voice cut through the night. I wouldn't run if I were you. Greg. He stepped into the clearing, hands in his pockets, looking calm, casual. But his eyes? Ice cold. Valerie inhaled sharply. You set me up, she hissed. Greg tilted his head. You set yourself up? Then, he glanced at me. Call them. I nodded and dialed the number. Aunt Valerie, Derek, and my mother were arrested 30 minutes later. The fallout was brutal. Mom and Derek had siphoned off even more money than we'd realized. Valerie had been moving cash into offshore accounts for years. The feds charged them with fraud, conspiracy, and a laundry list of financial crimes. They were done. Simon and Olivia were left reeling. Their mother, the woman who raised them, was a fraud. And me? For the first time in years, I wasn't the one struggling. Greg officially took me under his wing. And slowly, painfully, Simon and Olivia started to see the truth. They got jobs. Real ones. Olivia worked the front desk at the laundromat. Simon helped fix machines. It wasn't easy, but they tried. And I built something for myself. Not from stolen money. Not from greed. But from me. A year later, I stood outside the laundromat, watching the sunset paint the city in gold. Greg stepped beside me. You did good, kid. I smiled. For the first time in forever, I believed him. Life didn't magically fix itself after Valerie, Derek, and my mother were hauled away in handcuffs. There were still scars, some visible, some buried deep. Simon and Olivia barely spoke for weeks after the arrests. It wasn't just embarrassment. It was the realization that everything they believed about their family, their security, their privilege, was a lie. Valerie had stolen from them. Their own mother had been ready to disappear without a second thought. I'd spent so long resenting them for how they treated me that it hadn't occurred to me how much of their behavior was a byproduct of the woman who raised them. And now, for the first time in their lives, they were standing on unsteady ground. The first crack came when Olivia showed up at the laundromat on a Sunday afternoon, lingering near the counter as I counted out the register. I barely acknowledged her. Old habits. She cleared her throat. So, you really live here? I didn't look up. Why? Gonna start filming again? A guilty expression flickered across her face. No. She hesitated. I was an ass to you. I snorted. No kidding. She let out a small, bitter laugh. Yeah. Silence stretched between us. Then, I need a job. That made me look up. Olivia had never worked a day in her life. And now, here she was, in her designer sweater, shifting awkwardly on her heels. I studied her for a long moment. Why? She exhaled. Because college is on hold. And because Greg said I need to learn what it means to work for something. I leaned on the counter, pretending to think. Let me guess. He told you to ask me for a job? Her jaw tightened, but she nodded. I let the silence stretch again. Then, finally, I sighed. Fine, but you're starting at the bottom. No special treatment. I wasn't expecting any. I arched a brow. Really? You don't mind folding strangers' underwear for minimum wage? She grimaced. I mind, but I'll do it. I didn't know what surprised me more, that she actually seemed sincere, or that a part of me didn't hate the idea. All right, I said. You start tomorrow. She nodded, lingering for a second like she wanted to say more. But in the end, she just left, letting the glass door shut behind her. I wasn't sure what had just happened, but I had a feeling it was the start of something new. The next week, Simon came in. Unlike Olivia, he didn't even try to pretend he wasn't ashamed. He stood at the entrance of the laundromat for a solid 5 minutes, just staring at the floor like it might swallow him whole. I sighed. Are you gonna come in or just haunt the doorway? He walked in. Slow. Hesitant. I waited. Finally, he muttered, Greg says I need a job too. I tilted my head. And you actually want one? His jaw clenched. I don't deserve it, but I need it. That caught me off guard. I tapped my fingers against the counter. You any good with machines? He shrugged. I used to help Dad fix the car sometimes. I gestured to the industrial dryers. That's close enough. Welcome to maintenance duty. His lips twitched. You sure you want me working here? I smirked. Not really, but I think watching you struggle with broken washers will be entertaining. He snorted. You're evil. And you're late. Go grab some gloves. You've got lint traps to clean. For the first time in our lives, Simon actually listened to me. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Somewhere along the way, we stopped being enemies. It wasn't instant. Olivia still had her moments, grumbling about customers, cursing when she broke a nail. And Simon, despite having a real knack for fixing machines, still got defensive whenever I teased him about it. But there were also moments where we laughed, where we shared exhausted groans after a long shift, where I caught Olivia sneaking an extra dryer sheet into a struggling single mom's laundry and pretending it was store policy, where Simon stayed late to help an old man carry his clothes to his car, muttering something about how it's just manners, where I realized, slowly, cautiously, that maybe, just maybe, we weren't the same people we had been before. Maybe, in the strangest twist of fate, we were actually becoming a family. Not the kind we were born into, the kind we chose. One evening, months after everything had fallen apart, I was closing up when Greg walked into the laundromat, hands in his pockets. I smirked. If you're here to inspect, I charge a rich uncle tax. He chuckled, shaking his head. I'm here to offer you something. I frowned. Offer? He leaned against the counter. I want you to take over the laundromat. I blinked. What? I mean it. His gaze was steady. You've already been running the place better than my last manager. The numbers have improved, customer satisfaction's up. And, he hesitated, your dad would have wanted this for you. A lump formed in my throat. I swallowed it down. Greg, He held up a hand. No rush. Think about it. But I want you to have something that's yours. I exhaled slowly. Okay. He smiled. Okay. I watched as he walked out, the weight of the decision settling in. For the first time in my life, I had a choice. A real one. Not one made out of desperation or survival, but one made out of possibility. And that was worth everything. I didn't answer Greg right away. The offer sat in the back of my mind for weeks, haunting me every time I walked through the laundromat doors. It was tempting, beyond tempting. It was stability, security, something that was mine, but it was also terrifying. I had spent my whole life reacting, surviving, clawing my way through each day with no real direction, just doing whatever it took to make it to the next. Now, for the first time, I wasn't just being offered a lifeline. I was being offered a future, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. One night, after closing, I found Simon sitting outside the laundromat, staring at the neon sign like it held all the answers to life. I sat down next to him. He didn't look at me. You gonna take it? I hesitated. I don't know. He let out a short laugh. You? The girl who ran 2 jobs on 2 hours of sleep? You were basically running this place before Greg even offered it to you. I nudged his shoulder. What, are you rooting for me now? He rolled his eyes. I'm just saying, you earned it. That meant more than I wanted to admit. We sat in silence for a while, watching cars pass by. Then, Simon exhaled. I applied for college today. I turned to look at him. He stared straight ahead. I don't know if I'll get in. Don't even know if I want to go. But I figured I should try. A small smile tugged at my lips. That's new. He smirked. Yeah, well, turns out working for money instead of just having it changes your perspective. Shocking. He nudged me back. Shut up. I laughed. And just like that, I knew my answer. The next morning, I walked into Greg's office, took a deep breath, and said the words that scared me more than anything. I'll do it. Greg grinned. Good. Because I already had the paperwork drawn up. I groaned. You knew I was going to say yes. He shrugged. I had a hunch. I rolled my eyes. You're impossible. He just laughed and handed me the documents. I looked down at them, my name right there, bold and official. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was just surviving. I felt like I was building something. A year later, I stood outside the laundromat, the first business I had ever truly owned. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And as I watched Simon and Olivia bicker inside about who had to clean the machines, I realized something. We weren't just employees. We weren't just family by name. We were real family. And this time, nobody could take that away from us.